Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're set it up to hear more disturbing tales. Before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. It began quietly, almost insidiously, during the early years of my mom's life as a young mother. She was in her early 30s, caring for two small children, me, barely 3 years old, and my younger brother, still an infant. My dad left for work early in the mornings, often before sunrise, leaving my mom alone in the house with us. It was during these solitary hours that the phone calls started. At first, she might have thought it was a prank or a wrong number, but it quickly became clear that this was something far more sinister. The calls came with alarming regularity, almost like the man on the other end knew my dad's schedule. As soon as the house was quiet and it was just her with the kids, the phone would ring. My mom would pick up, only to hear a voice that filled her with dread from the moment he started speaking. His words were calculated and horrifying. He described, in chilling detail, the violent and depraved things he wanted to do to her. It wasn't just the content of his words, it was the tone, cold and deliberate, as though he had rehearsed every line. What made it worse was how much he seemed to know about her. Sometimes he described exactly what she was wearing at that moment: a robe, a pair of jeans, or even her hair tied back. Other times he would mention something she was doing, like folding laundry or playing with me and my brother. These weren't vague guesses, they were disturbingly accurate. It was clear he was watching her. The realization that someone could see her every move turned her home, her supposed sanctuary, into a place of fear. My mom became hyper-aware of her surroundings, but what could she do? She started drawing the curtains more tightly and avoided the windows altogether during certain times of the day. She tried to stay composed for the sake of her children, but the weight of that fear began to show. She would jump at small noises, her gaze darting to the windows or the phone, expecting another intrusion. The sense of being hunted never seemed to leave her. Financially, my parents were in a tough spot. Moving wasn't an option then, and the idea of staying at a hotel or relocating temporarily wasn't feasible. Instead, my mom began spending more time at my grandmother's house when my dad was working. It wasn't ideal, but being around another adult provided her with some comfort, even if the fear still loomed. The police became involved, but technology at the time had its limits. Tracing phone calls wasn't as simple as it is now, and the man on the other end seemed to know how to stay one step ahead. My mom would report every call, every detail she could remember, but the lack of progress only deepened her helplessness. Each time the phone rang, it was like a new wound, reopening the terror she felt every time she realized he was still there, still watching, still fixated on her. Through it all, she carried on, trying to shield us from her fear. But even as a child, I could sense something was wrong. The tension in the air was palpable, the way she would flinch at sudden noises or glance nervously at the windows. At the time, I didn't fully understand, but looking back, I realized how much strength it must have taken for her to get through those years while protecting us. The calls, the voice, and the knowledge that someone was always watching. It was an invisible battle she fought every day, trying to keep us safe in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous. After years of living in fear, my parents finally managed to save enough money to move. By the time we packed up and left, I was around 6 years old, and it felt like we were leaving a heavy, invisible weight behind. The new house was a chance for my mom to breathe again, to start fresh without the constant threat of those phone calls looming over her. With the move came a new unlisted phone number, carefully kept out of directories and known only to a select few. For the first time in years, the phone remained silent, free from the tormenting voice that had haunted her daily life. At first, the change brought some relief. The physical distance from the house where everything happened provided a sense of safety, as if leaving that place behind meant leaving the fear behind as well. My mom tried to settle into a routine, focusing on creating a warm, welcoming environment for our family. But while the calls had stopped, the psychological scars they left behind didn't fade so easily. The anxiety that had taken root in those years lingered, manifesting in ways that even as a child I could sense. My mom had always been strong and nurturing, but after the move, There were moments when she seemed distant. She would stand at the window, staring outside as if expecting something or someone to appear. At night, I would occasionally hear her walking around the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows, even though she'd already done it before going to bed. It became a nightly ritual, a way to reassure herself that we were safe. Sometimes, I would catch her peeking out through the curtains, her face tense, as if she was bracing for something to happen. The nightmares began not long after we moved. I didn't fully understand what they were at the time, but I'd find her in the mornings with red eyes and a shaken expression. When I asked what was wrong, she'd tell me it was nothing, just a bad dream. But the truth was, she was reliving the fear and helplessness of those years. The voice on the phone echoing in her mind even though the calls had stopped. She later told me how vivid the dreams were, how they brought back the feeling of being watched, of not knowing what might happen next. The emotional toll of those years weighed heavily on her. She wanted to put on a brave face for us, but there were moments when it all became too much. I remember finding her crying into her pillow one morning, trying to stifle her sobs so she wouldn't wake us. At the time, I didn't know why she was so upset, but her sadness was palpable, and it stayed with me. Looking back, I understand now that she was still processing the trauma, still trying to come to terms with the fact that someone had invaded her life in such an intimate and terrifying way. Despite the lingering fear, my mom was determined to move forward. She did her best to make our new house a home, filling it with warmth and love to counter the darkness of the past. But there was an unspoken tension that never fully went away. Even as we adjusted to our new surroundings, the memory of those years remained a shadow over her life, a reminder of how vulnerable she had been, and how close danger had come to our family. A few months after we had settled into our new home, life was beginning to feel normal again, or as normal as it could after what my mom had endured. Then came the call from the police. They informed my parents that they had identified and apprehended the person responsible for the years of harassment. The news should have brought relief, but the details they shared were deeply unsettling. It turned out that the stalker had been much closer than anyone could have imagined. Our next-door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He was someone we had seen in passing countless times, someone who had likely exchanged pleasantries with my parents or nodded a hello while we played in the yard. The realization that he had been watching my mom from just a few feet away, hiding in plain sight, sent a chill through all of us. The police explained that the young man had been discharged from the military due to severe mental health issues, and his obsession with my mom had been building for years. When they searched his room, they found a box filled with photographs of her. These weren't random snapshots, they were candid pictures, taken while she was outside gardening, playing with us kids, or simply sitting on the porch. The level of detail in the photos was haunting. It wasn't just that he had been watching, he had been documenting her every move, creating a private archive of his obsession. The officers also found other items in his possession that hinted at the depth of his fixation, though they didn't go into specifics with my parents. What they did say was enough to make it clear that his intentions had gone far beyond phone calls. The thought that he had been so close to us all those years, planning and observing, was terrifying. My mom had always suspected that the caller was nearby, but hearing confirmation brought a new wave of fear and disgust. Even though he was taken into custody and placed in a secure mental health facility, the revelation left a lasting impact on all of us. My mom, who had already been struggling to recover from the trauma, now had to grapple with the knowledge that her stalker had been living just a stone's throw away. It explained so much. How he had known what she was wearing or doing, how he had been able to time his calls so perfectly. But it also raised new questions. What would have happened if my dad had been gone longer? If my mom hadn't taken precautions? The what-ifs were almost too much to bear. The revelation also brought a new layer of fear for me, even as a child. The yard where we had played so freely now felt tainted. Every memory of being outside, laughing and running around, was overshadowed by the knowledge that someone had been watching us the whole time. My mom became even more vigilant, keeping a close eye on us whenever we were outside, as if she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unseen eyes on her. Even with the stalker gone, the scars he left remained. For my mom, the sense of safety and privacy she had once taken for granted was shattered. She became more cautious, more protective, and though life moved on, the experience never truly left her. The knowledge that someone so dangerous had been so close for so long was a reminder of just how fragile that sense of security could be. That summer, I didn't expect to be left in charge of my dad for several days. My mom and brother had a trip planned to visit colleges, leaving me behind to handle things at home. It felt like a manageable responsibility at first. After all, I was in college now. I thought I was mature enough to take care of my dad for a few days. But my confidence didn't account for how unpredictable things could get. My dad's Parkinson's had already been a challenge for our family, but over the past few months there had been a noticeable shift. His symptoms weren't just physical anymore. His mood swings were sharper, his responses colder. He seemed to drift in and out of moments of clarity, and it often felt like he was wrestling with something inside himself. Still, we thought it was something we could manage. Just keep him on schedule, my mom had told me before leaving. He likes his routine. Stick to it, and it'll be fine. The first day was anything but fine. From the moment my mom and brother pulled out of the driveway, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Tense, almost suffocating. Dad barely acknowledged me, retreating into the living room and staring blankly at the TV. When I tried to talk to him or ask if he needed anything, his responses were short and dismissive. I tried not to take it personally, but it was hard not to feel like he was shutting me out intentionally. Meals turned into a battle. I'd make something simple, place the plate in front of him, and ask if he was ready to eat. Most of the time, he wouldn't even look at me. He just sat there, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard me. When I repeated myself, his response was either a low grumble or complete silence. At one point, I raised my voice, frustrated at his refusal to cooperate, but that only made things worse. He glared at me, his eyes narrowing with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It wasn't like the usual frustration I'd seen in him. It felt deeper, almost hostile. By the evening, I was exhausted. I tried to distract myself by watching TV in another room, but I couldn't fully relax. The house was too quiet. Every creak and shuffle amplified in the absence of my mom and brother. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even when I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the situation, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. The next day followed a similar pattern. Dad resisted everything. Meals, medication, even basic conversations. It was like nothing I said or did could get through to him. I called my mom multiple times throughout the day, hoping she could talk him into cooperating. At first, it seemed to help. He'd grumble and reluctantly follow her instructions. But the moment I hung up the phone, his defiance returned. By the evening, I felt like I was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to approach him without setting him off. There was an unsettling weight in the air, a feeling that I couldn't quite put into words. The house, which usually felt warm and familiar, now seemed cold and uninviting. Even the usual hum of the refrigerator or the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway felt louder, almost intrusive. Every interaction with my dad added to my anxiety, and I couldn't help but feel like I was failing at the one thing I'd been asked to do. As the argument dragged on, the kitchen felt smaller and heavier with every passing second. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows on the counters and the lines of my dad's face. I could feel my patience slipping as I raised my voice, trying to get through to him, while he remained stubborn and unyielding. The phone pressed against my ear was slick with sweat, my mom's voice a mix of concern and frustration on the other end. She was doing her best to mediate from hundreds of miles away, but nothing seemed to work. Dad stood at the counter, gripping it with one hand while the other clutched the phone I'd given him. His knuckles were white, his shoulders tense. Even though he was only a few feet away, he didn't seem to register my presence in the room. It was like he was locked in his own world, and I was an unwelcome intruder, I could see his jaw clenching and unclenching, a silent battle playing out in his mind. He wasn't yelling anymore, but the intensity in the air was almost worse than the shouting had been. When he slammed the phone down on the counter, the sharp sound made me flinch. I instinctively took a step back, the realization sinking in that this was spiraling into something I didn't know how to handle. He turned to me, his face blank but his eyes hard, and held out his hand for the phone I was still holding. I hesitated, gripping it tightly, unsure of what he would do if I refused. His request wasn't loud or forceful, it was quiet, almost mechanical. "Give me the phone," he said, the words hanging in the air like a command. I shook my head, my own frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "No, Dad," I said firmly, but my voice cracked just slightly. That's when it happened. The change in him was so subtle at first that I almost didn't notice it. His posture straightened, his breathing slowed, and his expression became unnervingly calm. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and the man standing in front of me was no longer my father. "I'm going to kill you." The words came out in a tone so flat and emotionless that they didn't sound like his voice at all. It was the absence of anger or passion that made it so chilling, like he was stating a fact, not making a threat. My entire body froze, the phone still clenched in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. This wasn't a man losing his temper. This wasn't the Parkinson's. This was something entirely different, something I couldn't explain. The room felt suffocatingly quiet, save for the faint crackle of my mom's voice on the phone. Her words were muffled at first, but then they came through, clear and urgent. "Son, run." It took a moment for her words to register, but when they did, adrenaline flooded my system. My instincts took over, and I hurled the phone at him, not to hurt him, but to distract him, to break the spell of whatever was happening. The phone clattered to the floor near his feet, and for a moment, he didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on me, cold and unblinking, as though he was calculating something. I didn't wait to find out what his next move would be. My feet carried me out of the kitchen and down the hall before I even realized I was running. The carpet muffled the sound of my footsteps, but my ragged breathing seemed deafening in the stillness of the house. My keys were on the side table near the front door, and I grabbed them with trembling hands, nearly dropping them in my panic. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat, and the only thought in my mind was to get out. As I fumbled with the lock, I cast a quick glance over my shoulder. He wasn't following me, but the thought didn't bring me any comfort. The silence in the house felt more threatening than any noise could have. My fingers finally found the right key, and I threw open the door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. It was dark outside, the streetlights casting long shadows across the driveway, but I didn't care. I bolted to my car, my keys jingling in my hand as I unlocked the door and threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, tearing out of the driveway without looking back. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, and my chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the image of my dad standing there, cold and emotionless, was burned into my mind. Driving away from the house, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the doorway, or worse, following me down the street. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty road lit faintly by the streetlights. My knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and my mind raced, replaying the moment he spoke those chilling words. The calmness in his voice still echoed in my ears, and the look in his eyes felt like it was seared into my memory. It didn't feel like I had left him behind in the house. It felt like the moment itself was following me, clinging to me, no matter how far I drove. I pulled into an empty parking lot a few blocks away and parked under a flickering streetlight. The air inside the car was stifling, so I rolled down the window, hoping the cool night breeze would help me calm down. It didn't. My hands were trembling, and I realized I still hadn't caught my breath. I grabbed my phone, my mom still on the line, her voice laced with panic. "Are you okay? Where are you?" she asked. I tried to answer, but my voice cracked, and all I could manage was a weak, "I don't know." The next day, when I finally returned home, I approached the house cautiously, half expecting something to feel off, but everything seemed normal. My dad was sitting in his usual spot in the living room, watching TV as if nothing had happened. He greeted me with a casual nod, no hint of the events from the night before. I didn't bring it up, and neither did he. It was as if that moment had been erased from his memory, or maybe he had no memory of it at all. In the weeks that followed, I avoided being alone with him whenever possible. I made excuses to stay out late or leave the house early, always keeping a safe distance. Even though he seemed fine, normal even, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man I had seen that night was still there, lurking beneath the surface. It was a fear I carried with me long after the incident, a quiet unease that lingered every time I was near him. The night had been quiet at first, just me in my room enjoying the familiar comfort of late-night TV. The soft hum of the screen was a backdrop to the muffled stillness that only comes when the rest of the house is asleep, the kind of quiet where every creak of the house feels amplified. I had my curtains drawn, as usual, and the only light came from the flickering TV in the corner. It was a normal night, or so I thought. It started with a noise, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the show I was watching. I dismissed it as one of the usual suspects, maybe squirrels scampering across the roof or the occasional gust of wind brushing against the house. Living in a neighborhood with mature trees, you get used to these things. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound didn't fade. If anything, it grew more distinct, and the hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. I turned the TV volume up a notch, hoping to drown it out. But the sound persisted, creeping into my awareness until I couldn't focus on anything else. It was no longer just a scuffle or scrape. It had a rhythm, an almost deliberate pattern that made it impossible to dismiss as random. And it was too close, far closer than I was comfortable with. It wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from the side of the house, near my window. I pressed pause on the remote, plunging the room into silence. I sat there for a moment, listening intently. The sound continued, faint but deliberate, like a soft scraping or tapping. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the glass of the window or the siding, but it was definitely nearby. My chest tightened as I stared at the curtain, suddenly hyper-aware of how thin it was. The idea of someone, or something, on the other side made my pulse quicken. I debated with myself about what to do. Should I look out the window, call someone, or just ignore it and hope it went away? Rationally, I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a bird. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. Still, I didn't want to overreact. I grabbed my phone, thinking about texting a friend, but stopped. What would I even say? I think there's something outside my window? It sounded ridiculous. As the noise dragged on, irritation began to override my unease. I decided to scare off whatever it was. I balled my fist and gave 2 loud bangs against the wall, just below the window. The sound reverberated through the room, satisfying in its boldness. I waited, expecting to hear the scuttle of claws retreating or the sudden silence that would confirm the intruder was gone. Instead, I heard 2 distinct bangs in reply. The sound was sharp and deliberate, as though someone had mimicked my exact movements. My breath caught in my throat and a chill shot through me. It wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. Animals don't respond like that. The realization sank in like a weight, and I felt a surge of panic. Someone was out there, someone who had just answered my knock. I froze, my body tense, as I tried to process what had just happened. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in as I stared at the curtain. My instinct told me not to move, not to draw attention to myself, but I couldn't just sit there. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the door. I needed to get out of there, to put some distance between myself and whatever, or whoever, was outside. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears as I stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound. Every creak of the floor felt deafening as I inched toward the door, my eyes fixed on the curtain the entire time. The thought of pulling it back to look filled me with dread. What if I saw something staring back at me? What if they saw me? I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I slipped out of the room and headed downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. My focus shifted to the living room, where the bay window offered a view of the side of the house. If someone was out there, I'd be able to see them from the safety of the first floor. I crept downstairs, each step of the staircase creaking softly under my weight. My heart was racing, and my breaths came shallow and quick. The bay window in the living room was my only plan. It offered a side angle to my bedroom window without requiring me to go outside or look through the glass directly above. The living room was dimly lit by a small lamp I had left on earlier, casting long, soft shadows on the walls. I felt exposed even as I moved through my own house, like every movement could be watched. Reaching the bay window, I crouched down slightly, keeping out of direct view as I peered out cautiously. The yard was bathed in faint light from a street lamp further down the block, but it was enough to make out shapes. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty lawn, the street beyond, and the familiar silhouette of my house's exterior. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything, that my nerves had gotten the better of me. Then I saw him. Standing directly below my bedroom window was a man. His posture was unnervingly casual, as if he belonged there. The faint light caught the outline of his figure, and I could just make out the object in his hand, a small knife, glinting faintly in the darkness. But it wasn't just the knife that sent a wave of panic through me. It was what he was doing. He wasn't attempting to break in or acting erratic. Instead, he was running his hand along the siding of the house, slowly and deliberately, almost like he was petting it. The motion was methodical, almost hypnotic in its repetition, and the stillness of his figure against the backdrop of the quiet street made the scene even more surreal. He seemed completely engrossed in what he was doing, as though he had all the time in the world. I couldn't hear anything from where I was, but the visual was enough to paralyze me. I froze, unsure of what to do. The rational part of my brain screamed for me to grab my phone and call for help, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. It was as though looking away would break some kind of invisible barrier, letting him know I was there. My body felt like it was locked in place, caught between the instinct to flee and the need to assess the situation. The longer I watched, the stranger the scene became. He wasn't moving anywhere else, wasn't looking around. It was like his entire focus was on the act of touching the house. I felt a sickening mix of fear and confusion. Why was he there? What did he want? The small knife in his hand looked almost out of place, more like an afterthought than a tool for breaking in. Yet, its presence made everything feel more sinister. I moved back slightly from the window, careful not to make any noise. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, which I had left on the coffee table earlier. It felt like an eternity before my fingers found it, and even longer as I fumbled to unlock it. I knew I needed to call the police, but the thought of speaking aloud, even into the phone, terrified me. What if he heard me? What if the sound drew his attention? The entire time, I kept glancing back at the window, half expecting him to have vanished. But he was still there, still standing beneath my room, his movements slow and deliberate. It was as if he didn't care about being caught, like he wanted to be seen. That thought alone sent another wave of fear through me. I pressed 911 and held the phone close to my ear, whispering as quietly as I could to the operator. My voice shook as I described the man, his actions, and the fact that he was armed. As the operator assured me that help was on the way, I couldn't help but glance out the window again. He hadn't moved. The eerie stillness of his presence, combined with the rhythmic motion of his hand against the siding, was almost too much to process. The minutes stretched endlessly as I waited for the police to arrive. Every small noise, from the house creaking to the distant hum of a passing car, felt amplified. My eyes were glued to the man outside, still standing beneath my bedroom window. His slow, deliberate movements continued, almost trance-like. He showed no signs of noticing me or the impending arrival of the police, which only made the whole situation feel more surreal. Finally, the faint sound of sirens cut through the stillness of the night. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the tension of what might happen next. The man didn't react to the sound at first, his focus seemingly unbroken. As the sirens grew louder, I wondered if he would run or try to hide, but he remained eerily still, as though the approaching police didn't matter to him. When the squad car pulled up in front of the house, its lights casting red and blue flashes across the lawn, the man finally moved. He stepped back slightly from the house, lowering his hand from the siding but still holding the knife loosely at his side. His posture didn't change much. He wasn't panicked or aggressive, just still. The officers exited their vehicle, hands ready but not yet drawing their weapons. They approached cautiously, calling out commands for him to drop the knife. The man turned slightly toward them, and for a moment I thought he might resist or try to flee. But instead, he complied, letting the knife fall to the ground with a dull thud. He raised his hands, palms open, and stood there as they closed in. Even as they cuffed him and led him toward the squad car, he didn't say a word. His expression remained unreadable, neither angry nor distressed, which somehow made the whole scene even more unnerving. When they left, taking the man with them, the house felt oppressively silent again. The house we moved into was everything we were looking for, a cozy, well-maintained property with plenty of space for our family. Yet, the history of the house cast a shadow over our excitement. We learned during the purchasing process that the renter who had lived there previously had passed away suddenly in his mid-40s. The cause was listed as natural, but the fact that it happened right in the middle of the living room gave the place an uneasy aura. We didn't dwell on it too much at the time, though. Death, while tragic, felt like a distant, abstract thing. We focused instead on settling in and making the house our own. It wasn't long after moving in that odd things began to creep into our daily life. Small, almost dismissible moments that, on their own, wouldn't have raised suspicion. The air in the house often felt unusually still, and there were pockets of the home, like the basement or certain corners of the living room, that seemed inexplicably colder, even when the rest of the house was warm. At first, I shrugged it off as quirks of an older home. After all, houses take time to learn, and I figured these were the kinds of things you stopped noticing after a while. Then came the comments from our 2-year-old daughter. Almost as soon as we moved in, she began talking about a ghost. At her age, she was in that stage where everything new and exciting captured her imagination, and Halloween had just passed, which made her fascination with ghosts seem like a harmless phase. She had a particular Halloween-themed picture book she loved, filled with cartoon ghosts, bats, and jack-o'-lanterns, and she insisted we read it almost every night. So when she casually started mentioning that the ghost was in her playhouse, in the basement, or standing by the stairs, I assumed it was just her imagination at work. But her mentions of the ghost were oddly specific. She didn't just refer to it as the ghost in a general sense. She would point to exact spots, saying things like, "He's standing in the corner," or "He's on the stairs." At one point, she even told me the ghost liked her playhouse and spent time there when she wasn't around. These weren't things she seemed to be making up on the spot. There was a consistency in how she described the ghost's presence, which was unsettling. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had just become fixated on the idea of a ghost because of her book. Or maybe it was a phase she'd grow out of soon enough. What struck me most was her attitude toward this so-called ghost. She never seemed afraid of it. On the contrary, she talked about it as if it were a friend or a normal part of her day-to-day life. Her nonchalant demeanor made it easier for me to dismiss the possibility of anything unusual. If she wasn't scared, why should I be? It became almost routine for her to make these comments, and I treated them as quirks of her vivid toddler imagination. Still, there were moments when I couldn't quite shake the eerie feeling that came with her words, especially when she pointed out places where the ghost was supposedly standing. Something about her calm certainty made it hard to brush off completely. The more I thought about it, the more I found myself talking directly to this ghost. On occasion, I'd say things out loud, like, "You're welcome to stay here if it makes you happy," or, "If you want to go, that's fine too." It felt silly, even a little ridiculous, but in those quiet moments when the house seemed too still, it brought a strange kind of comfort. Whether or not the ghost was real didn't matter. Acknowledging it seemed to ease the tension I didn't realize I was carrying. Looking back, I wonder if that was the first sign that I wasn't as skeptical as I tried to convince myself I was. As the weeks went by, our daughter's comments about the ghost became a regular part of our routine. She spoke about it with such casual certainty that it almost felt normal, like mentioning a family pet or a neighbor. It wasn't just a passing fascination either. She would confidently point out specific places where the ghost was standing or sitting. The playhouse in the basement, in particular, seemed to be its favorite spot. She'd tell me, "The ghost is in the playhouse," with the same tone she used to announce that her favorite show was on TV. What struck me was how consistent her observations were. It wasn't like she was randomly inventing new stories or embellishing the ghost's presence. It was always the same few spots, as if she had mapped out its routine. The ghost was never in her bedroom or mine, for instance, which was oddly comforting in its own way. Despite her frequent mentions, she never seemed scared or upset. If anything, she seemed to enjoy its company. Sometimes, she would even smile or wave in its direction, like she was greeting a friend. Her attitude toward the ghost made it easier for me to dismiss the idea that there might be something genuinely unusual going on. I mean, what harm could a friendly, imaginary ghost possibly cause? At the same time, I couldn't deny that her certainty made me a little uneasy. There were moments when her casual remarks felt too specific to ignore. Once, while she was playing in the living room, she turned to me and said, "The ghost likes it here because it's quiet." The simplicity of her statement caught me off guard. It was a strange thing for a 2-year-old to say, and I couldn't help but wonder where she got that idea. Still, I tried to keep things lighthearted. On a few occasions, I spoke to the ghost myself, half joking and half serious. "If you're happy here, you're welcome to stay," I'd say. Or, "If you'd rather move on, that's okay too." It felt a little silly, but I told myself that if there really was a ghost, acknowledging its presence couldn't hurt. I didn't want to dismiss my daughter's experience outright, even if I didn't fully believe in it myself. One morning, as we were heading out the door, she suddenly stopped and pointed toward the back deck. "The ghost is outside," she said matter-of-factly. It was still dark and raining lightly, and the sight of the empty deck through the window sent a small shiver down my spine. I asked her how she knew the ghost was there, and she just shrugged as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Then, with her usual cheerfulness, she added, "It's the ghost's birthday today. We should sing happy birthday." At that moment, I couldn't help but laugh. She had made us sing happy birthday to all sorts of things before. Mickey Mouse, her stuffed animals, even random objects like a bowl of cereal. So this didn't feel too unusual. Indulging her, we sang the song together, her little voice leading the way, and I wished the ghost a happy birthday. It was a sweet, silly moment that felt entirely normal at the time, even as the rain continued to patter against the windows and the early morning darkness lingered outside. It wasn't until later that day that I began to feel unsettled. As I thought back to her insistence about the ghost's birthday, a small seed of curiosity began to grow. Where had she gotten the idea? Why did she seem so sure? The thought stuck with me, nagging at the edges of my mind as I went about the rest of my day. What if there was more to her words than just the whimsy of a 2-year-old's imagination? Later that afternoon, the curiosity I'd been feeling all day became too much to ignore. My daughter's comment about the ghost's birthday kept replaying in my head, and I found myself wondering if there was any chance it could mean something. The logical part of me still leaned heavily toward her imagination being the source. But there was another part, a quieter, more unsettled part, that wasn't so sure. I decided to look up the obituary of the previous renter, just to satisfy my curiosity. It didn't take long to find. The listing was straightforward, just a few lines confirming his name, age, and date of death. As my eyes scanned down the page, I felt my breath catch. There, listed in black and white, was his date of birth. It was the same day, that day. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as a wave of disbelief washed over me. I had brushed off so much as coincidence or childish whimsy, but this was something else entirely. There was no way my 2-year-old daughter could have known his birthday. We had never discussed the man who had lived in the house before us. and even if we had, there's no scenario where she could have picked up that specific detail. And yet, she'd been so sure. She had insisted on singing to the ghost, convinced it was his special day. I tried to rationalize it, to find a way to explain it away, but the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't just the accuracy of her statement, it was the confidence with which she had said it. It wasn't a guess or a question. To her, it was a fact. She hadn't just imagined a ghost. She had connected with something deeper, something that seemed impossible to explain. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the series of events that had led to this moment. Every casual mention of the ghost, every instance of her pointing out where it stood, now felt different. What if there was something more to her words than I had been willing to believe? The idea that we might have been sharing our home with the lingering presence of the man who had lived there before us felt both absurd and unsettlingly plausible. From that day forward, I couldn't look at her interactions with the ghost the same way. I didn't bring it up with her again, not wanting to influence or disturb her, but I paid closer attention. Every comment, every glance toward an empty corner of the room took on a weight I hadn't noticed before. Whether or not I believed in ghosts, one thing was certain. My daughter's connection to something unseen was far more real than I had ever imagined. The farmhouse sat alone, surrounded by 10 acres of land that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. On clear days, the snow-capped mountains in the distance were a breathtaking sight, but at night, that same expanse felt oppressive, like the darkness could swallow you whole. The isolation was by design, a deliberate choice by the man's family to give him privacy and keep others at a safe distance due to his unpredictable outbursts. While practical for its purpose, the solitude created a constant, nagging awareness that help was miles away, both physically and mentally. The house itself had a way of amplifying that isolation. Built decades earlier, it was a simple structure, but its age showed in the warped floorboards, the slight sag in the ceiling beams, and the perpetually creaking staircase. The windows were single-paned and drafty, letting in the icy chill of Oregon winters, no matter how much we stuffed the cracks with weather stripping. The heating system groaned to life every so often, but it was no match for the relentless cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. The faint metallic hum of the radiators became part of the soundtrack of my nights there. The staff room, where I spent most of my evenings, was tucked away at the back of the house, sparsely furnished with second-hand furniture. The futon, with its sagging springs and faintly musty smell, was far from comfortable, but it was the only option for sleeping during my shifts. A small TV sat on a rickety stand, its screen glowing faintly in the dark room as I flipped through static-filled channels, looking for something to keep my mind off the silence. A single lamp with a cracked shade provided the only light, casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. It wasn't much, but I'd learned to make it work over the years. During the day, the house felt slightly less ominous, with sunlight streaming through the dusty windows and the occasional sounds of wildlife breaking the silence. But as soon as the sun set, the atmosphere changed. The once harmless creaks and groans of the old house seemed sharper and more deliberate in the dark. The wind outside often howled through the trees, rattling the windows and creating an eerie symphony of sounds that made the isolation feel even more pronounced. I often found myself glancing at the clock, counting the hours until sunrise, when the house would feel somewhat normal again. The routine of locking my client in his room each night was mechanical at this point. His room, sparse but secure, was designed to keep him safe from himself and others safe from his violent outbursts. After double-checking the locks, I'd retreat to the staff room and settle into my nightly ritual of flipping through channels, eating a lukewarm meal, and trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that came with being so utterly alone. Nights were long, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the faint scurrying of mice in the walls. Despite spending years in the house, I never got used to how it felt at night, like the darkness carried a presence of its own, watching and waiting. It wasn't fear exactly, but a persistent tension that never fully went away. The knowledge that the house was miles from anyone else added to the weight of the quiet. Even the most mundane sounds, a floorboard creaking, the refrigerator cycling on, could make my heart race for a moment before I convinced myself it was nothing. But one winter night, that fragile sense of routine and rationality would be completely shattered, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the house and its solitude. It was a bitterly cold January night when the eerie stillness of the house was shattered. I had just turned off the TV and settled onto the worn futon in the staff room, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin in an attempt to keep warm. The wind outside was relentless, howling through the trees and occasionally rattling the windows. The draft in the room made it feel like the cold was alive, creeping around every corner and pressing against my skin. Despite the discomfort, my body was heavy with the exhaustion of the day, and I could feel myself slipping into a light sleep. Suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the night. It wasn't muffled or distant. It sounded like it was right outside the window, sharp and immediate, sending a jolt through my entire body. My first reaction was to freeze, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. It wasn't a typical sound you'd associate with the wildlife in the area. This was distinctly human, a blood-curdling cry that carried a raw, almost primal fear. For a moment, I couldn't move, my mind scrambling to rationalize the noise. Perhaps it was a neighbor, though the nearest house was a mile away. Or maybe someone had wandered onto the property. But what would they be doing out here in the middle of the night? And why would they scream like that? The questions tumbled through my head as I sat frozen on the futon, the silence that followed the scream pressing down on me like a weight. The window in the staff room faced the backyard, a pitch-black void beyond the glass. I forced myself to sit up, every nerve in my body on edge. Grabbing the flashlight from the laundry room just off the staff quarters, I hesitated at the back door. The thought of stepping outside into the darkness made my stomach churn, but I needed to know what was out there. The handle felt icy under my hand as I slowly turned it and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating patches of snow and the gnarled branches of the trees. I swept it back and forth across the backyard, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the space was empty. The only sound was the wind, its low moan almost masking the faint crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I stepped further out, scanning the perimeter of the house, my breath visible in the cold air. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized just how vulnerable I was out here, alone and exposed. Walking along the side of the house, I strained my ears for any hint of movement. The flashlight's beam caught the glint of frost on the ground, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the sound. The wind picked up, carrying with it faint whispers of noise that I couldn't quite place, adding to the growing unease in my chest. My thoughts began to spiral. Was someone out there watching me? Were they hiding just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to turn my back? I completed a slow circle around the house, my eyes darting between the shadows and the underbrush. There was nothing, no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. And yet the scream had been so real, so close. I stood in the yard for a moment, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, before retreating back inside and locking the door behind me. The house felt colder than before, and the silence was heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat on the futon, staring at the window and clutching the flashlight, replaying the scream over and over in my head. It wasn't an animal, I was certain of that. It was human, or something that could mimic human emotion with unsettling precision. As the hours crawled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that sound wasn't gone. It was out there, somewhere in the dark, watching and waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the first hints of dawn began to creep through the windows, bathing the room in a faint, cold light. I had spent the remainder of the night sitting on the edge of the futon, clutching the flashlight, my mind racing with possibilities. The sound of the scream was still vivid in my memory, replaying over and over like a broken record. It wasn't just the scream itself that unsettled me. It was the complete absence of any explanation for it. The silence that followed had been almost louder than the scream, amplifying the eerie stillness that had engulfed the house. As daylight slowly seeped into the room, I felt a small sense of relief, though the tension in my chest didn't fully subside. The house, which had always been unnervingly quiet at night, now felt strangely different, as if the walls themselves held on to the energy from the previous night. I forced myself to move, to do something productive to shake off the lingering fear. But even the mundane tasks, brewing coffee, folding blankets, felt heavy and strange, like they were somehow being observed. The isolation of the property, which had been a manageable backdrop to my routine for years, now felt suffocating. The wide open space around the house seemed to stretch endlessly, and yet it felt as though the perimeter of the property had closed in. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the siding, sent a fresh jolt of unease through me. My eyes kept drifting to the window where I'd first heard the scream, as if expecting to see something or someone staring back at me. My coworker arrived later that morning for their shift, their cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the tension I was carrying. As they walked through the door, I felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. I hesitated to bring up what had happened, partly because I didn't want to sound paranoid, and partly because speaking it aloud felt like it might give the experience more power. Instead, I settled for vague comments about a restless night and a need for better sleep, leaving out the details that had shaken me to my core. That evening began like many others when I stayed late to wrap up work. The office, though usually buzzing during the day, becomes eerily quiet after hours. My office mate and I were the only ones left in our wing, separated from the rest of the building by long corridors and a few closed doors. The air conditioning had clicked off for the day, leaving only the occasional hum of the building settling. It was the kind of silence where even the faintest noise feels amplified. Around 7 p.m., my office mate and I were engrossed in our tasks. The hallway lights outside our office cast long, pale reflections on the tiled floor, and the faint glow of our computer screens filled the room. The muffled tap of keyboards was the only sound, a rhythm so consistent that it made the sudden loud noise all the more jarring. The sound wasn't subtle, it was the unmistakable slam of a door. It echoed through the corridor, sharp and deliberate. I instinctively stopped typing and turned to my office mate, who had already frozen mid-sentence. Both of us stared at the doorway to our office, half expecting someone to walk through it. The hallway outside felt ominously still, as though the air had shifted. I decided to check, my curiosity getting the better of me. I opened the office door cautiously and peered into the hallway. Everything appeared normal. The doors were shut, the hallway lights unchanged, yet it felt different. The usually mundane stretch of the corridor now seemed unnervingly long and empty. I took a few hesitant steps out, the sound of my shoes echoing faintly, but nothing seemed amiss. No loose hinges, no wind drafts, and no signs of anyone else in the building. Returning to the office, I shrugged it off with a nervous laugh, attempting to dismiss it as just an odd noise. Old buildings make weird sounds, I told my office mate, but the reassurance felt hollow. She nodded but kept glancing towards the door, her unease mirroring my own. For the rest of the evening, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just the silence. It was the kind that felt almost too quiet, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Every creak, faint hum, or distant sound seemed exaggerated, and I found myself startled by things I wouldn't normally notice. My office mate and I avoided discussing the noise further, as if speaking about it might invite it back. The night passed without further incident, but that moment stuck with me. As I left the building, walking through the now empty parking lot, I couldn't help but glance back at the office wing. The thought of that door slamming, with no one there to close it, lingered in my mind, refusing to let go. The unsettling experience of that night might have been easier to shrug off if the strange occurrences had stopped there. However, over the next 2 weeks, when I stayed late to bank hours for winter break, the eerie noises persisted, growing harder to dismiss as coincidence. It wasn't constant, but the sporadic sounds were enough to keep me on edge. At first, I tried to focus on my work, reasoning that the building was old and prone to creaks and groans. But some noises didn't fit that narrative. The first sound that stood out was faint but deliberate. It resembled the soft slide of a shoe on the tile floor, coming from the hallway just outside my office. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening intently. The sound came again, just a single faint scrape, as though someone had shifted their weight or dragged their foot slightly while walking. I called out, half expecting to hear the janitor reply or see someone pass by, but there was no response. Stepping cautiously to the doorway, I peeked into the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. There was nothing there. The hallway was completely empty. As the nights went on, the noises continued, sometimes louder, sometimes barely perceptible. A faint creak here, a subtle rustle there, often just enough to make me pause and listen, but never loud enough to confirm what I was hearing. A few times, I even wondered if I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet, isolated environment. Yet, the sensations of unease were real enough to make me constantly glance over my shoulder. The janitor, who usually worked earlier in the evening, began to voice her concerns as well. One night, I overheard her muttering to herself as she emptied the trash cans in my wing. When I asked if everything was all right, she hesitated before admitting that she'd been hearing strange noises too. Doors closing, faint footsteps, and once, a muffled bang from the kitchen area. She mentioned checking the kitchen one evening and finding the light on, even though she was certain she had turned it off before locking the door. I nodded, recognizing her unease, but neither of us wanted to dwell too much on it. We both chalked it up to forgetfulness or random quirks of the building. One night, we decided to investigate the noises together. Walking through the dimly lit hallways, we checked every door and window, making sure everything was securely locked. Everything seemed in order, no open doors, no windows ajar, but when we circled back, the light in the kitchen was on again. The janitor's face went pale, and she whispered that this wasn't the first time she had seen that happen. My stomach sank. I hadn't noticed it before, but the thought of an unexplained pattern in such a mundane detail was deeply unnerving. The incidents, though minor on their own, began to accumulate into something I couldn't ignore. Each night, I found myself walking faster through the hallways, avoiding lingering in dimly lit areas. The building, which had always been a place of routine and familiarity, now felt different, like it wasn't entirely mine after hours. I still couldn't explain the noises, but I knew they weren't going away. As the weeks went on, I began asking around, casually at first, about whether anyone else in the building had noticed anything unusual. It was partly to reassure myself that I wasn't going crazy, but also out of a growing sense of curiosity and unease. The responses I received were a mix of hesitant admissions and eerie confirmations that made me question everything I thought I knew about the space we worked in daily. One colleague, a woman who worked in another wing, hesitated when I brought up the noises. She seemed torn between dismissing my concerns and validating them. Eventually, she admitted that she'd noticed small, odd things, like her office decorations being slightly out of place when she returned from a quick trip to the restroom. It wasn't major, just a photo frame tilted or her coffee mug moved to a different part of her desk, but enough to make her pause. She joked nervously, calling it the office ghost, but I could tell she was more unsettled than she let on. Another coworker had an even stranger story. She told me about coming into her office one morning and finding a footprint in the middle of her desk. It wasn't a smudge or dirt. It was an actual clear print, like someone had stepped on the surface with bare feet. Her desk had a black laminate finish, the kind that easily shows skin oils or fingerprints, and there it was, unmistakable. She tried to wipe it off, but the thought of someone, or something, standing there lingered in her mind. She didn't know what to make of it, and hadn't mentioned it to anyone else until I brought up my own experiences. These conversations were enough to unsettle me further, but the janitor's reaction was what truly cemented the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as she was finishing up her cleaning routine, I mentioned the noises in passing. She stopped mid-task, her hand gripping the mop handle tightly, and looked at me with wide eyes. She admitted that she hated being in the building after dark, especially in the wing where I worked. The light in the kitchen being on when it shouldn't have been wasn't a one-off occurrence. She'd seen it multiple times, and it always gave her the creeps. Once, she swore she heard muffled laughter coming from an empty room, but when she checked, no one was there. The collective weight of these stories created a picture that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just me hearing things in the hallway late at night, or the janitor being spooked by unexplained lights. It was the footprint on the desk, the rearranged decorations, the lingering sense of being watched. And as much as I wanted to attribute it all to quirks of an old building or overactive imaginations, the sheer consistency of the experiences made that explanation feel increasingly hollow. By the time I'd pieced everything together, the building no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like something else entirely, something I couldn't explain but couldn't dismiss either. Each time I stayed late after that, I kept one eye on the clock and the other on the hallway, waiting for the next sound, the next small, inexplicable detail to remind me that the building held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover.